So I'll let everyone know up front that I'm in Dallas and our power went out for a couple minutes about an hour and a half ago, but then it came back on. But hopefully I won't have any more issues. But it went down like in several neighborhoods. So it must be the 75-degree weather in Dallas today that threw everything off.
It was probably that big party in Arkansas last night that threw your power out.
Let's give it one more minute and then we can get started. All right, well, seems like we have a quorum, so let's get started. Before I start talking, I was wondering whether Representative Tarwater or Tien, you wanted to kind of kick us off with any thoughts, or?
This is Sean, and I don't have a whole lot to say. I'm at a work site today, so I'm kind of mobile. I'm looking forward to see how everybody ranks everything, and we can discuss from there.
Great, thanks. Tien?
I have no comments. Just looking forward to rolling up our sleeves and getting into this.
Awesome. Well, we got the right motto here, right? Ad astra per aspera, right? You know, reaching the stars through hard work. So pretty appropriate because we're going to be going through a lot of stuff today. And just as a heads up, the homework assignment between this meeting as well to the next session will be a decent amount of work for the panelists. So we'll get into that in a bit, but I just wanted to kind of give you that heads up. We're going to be needing to roll up our sleeves over the next couple of weeks or so. Go to the next slide. So today, as usual, I'll go through kind of the purpose and set the context. Then we'll be able to spend some time talking about the prioritization of the programmatic areas that the advisory panel had narrowed in on. And, you know, with some of the, you know, other work that the panel has done in terms of kind of looking at those areas, that'll be reflected. And we've done a little bit of kind of structuring of some of those areas as well. We pushed a couple things together and maybe reframed one of them a little bit, but we'll be able to talk through that to make sure that that reflects everyone on the panel's point of view. Then the bulk of the time, we're going to discuss kind of a draft of these program templates that we've been getting some input from the panel on, as well as some outside input. But we really want to make sure as we go through each one that they reflect the view of the advisory panel in terms of, you know, how they're shaped. And in particular, we want to spend a good amount of time within each program around the panel defining a set of parameters for each program, because per the homework that I had just talked about earlier, we're going to use those parameters, or the panel members will, in a homework between this session and the next session, to go through all of the idea submissions and be able to rate all of them based on the fit that they have with the particular program area that they'd fall into, that the panel had created. And then we'll talk a little bit at the end around the next steps, go into that homework in a little bit more in detail and talk about how it's going to set us up for the next session. Go to the next slide. So just as a reminder, we always show this slide, as we're tracking our progress through the process. So once again, we started, at the start of this kind of funnel of thinking with lots of input, brainstorming from the advisory panel, which is extended through the process, research on what other states were doing in this area, basic needs and opportunities assessment in the state, internal, external interviews. We brought in several experts, a lot, particularly 3 in our last session, and then community input, as extension of the listening sessions that had happened last year. We added a public submission option around investment ideas that we gathered with a consistent submission form. We've continued to work that process in terms of identifying the areas to focus in on. And that's kind of where we are stand right now. What we need to do is to be able to rank those areas for investment, as well as begin thinking through kind of, how they need to be shaped, because that will help us, think about, how these investment ideas may or may not fit into the various program areas. Not that every program area is going to be completely defined by the investment ideas, because some of them, based on the brainstorming of the group, are kind of broader ideas. So there aren't any submission forms for some of the areas, or at least that take up a portion of the scope of some of the areas. So anyway, keep going. All this should become apparent as we start walking through a little bit more detail. So we just talked about this. Today, we're going to review the prioritization of those programmatic areas. I believe we have 7. Finalize the program shaping, definition, outcomes, impact, feasibility, and also the advisory panel is going to define. We'll give some, like an initial starting set for you guys to kind of kick around, but for the panel itself to define the program parameters. Next slide. I think this largely says what we said in the last slide. So this is all in anticipation of, coming out of the 5th meeting of this advisory panel, being able to put forward, its recommendation and present it to the Spark Executive Committee. Once again, the Spark Executive Committee is going to be looking at recommendations from the 4 panels, and there will be more recommendations on what to fund that will be able to be funded in the set of funds that the Spark Executive Committee is working with. So there will be trade-offs at that point. So, there will be some things probably in most of the panels that won't end up going forward in this process as trade-offs are made at the Spark Executive Committee level. Next slide. So once again today, focusing in on the program's relative importance, defining the program parameters. We'll discuss the approach to prioritize across the programs a little bit more offline. We're going to continue to rank the programmatic ideas and also begin to have the panel provide some input on potential funding amounts, because it could be that you decide that 5 of the programmatic areas really deserve the bulk of the funds and the recommendation. We want to start getting a read from the panelists, how they think about that. The idea submissions that are good fits will provide some of that input, but also want to get a view from the panelists themselves. And then once again, as a pre-work for the next session, we will have a homework assignment for each panelist to rate those idea submissions based on the level of fit with the program parameters. So defining high, medium, low in terms of the fit of each one of those idea submissions. And that could be a decent amount of work depending upon, given the number of submissions, depending upon how familiar everyone is with all of the submissions at this point after having kind of gone back and forth and looked at them over the last few weeks. Go to the next slide. So once again, have shown the slide every single meeting. No doubt we'll show it every single meeting going forward. But these are the guiding principles that the Spark Executive Committee had put together around investment of the ARPA funds. And I think it's something that we all need to have top of mind, particularly the panelists who are going to be making the calls in terms of what to invest in. Number one, prioritize sustainable programs and investments through one-time use of funds. So let's not think, deprioritizing or not focusing on things that would cause kind of ongoing expansion of existing services or unfunded mandates or anything like that. So really catalytic investments. Combined with leverage local and agency funds to maximize use of discretionary funds. Really this is kind of understanding, in some of the areas that you could focus on, particularly in a landscape as big as economic revitalization, there some things that are important but are being focused on with other sets of funds. And also, looking for the opportunities, particularly on things that might have a state and local component to it, making sure that we have the right view as to how to leverage those different sets of funds. Foster long-term systemic impact for Kansans. And this is really, I think, for this process and how it's structured, kind of the long pole in the tent. So really focusing on the things that are going to be difference makers for Kansas over the long term. Consider equitable opportunities and outcomes, enable flexibility within the investment strategies, and also ensure that the results are measurable to enable tracking and transparency, which we've also tried to reflect in this process as well. The panel should continue to have those top of mind as we're looking through all of these opportunities and shaping them. Next slide. These are the.
Can I ask
Go ahead.
Can I ask a clarifying question, please?
Yes, sir.
Would you mind? I just want to make sure that I understand kind of the vision, the direction. Back on, it's a few slides back on slide 6.
Yep. Go back.
Would you mind? I guess defining a little bit more those 3 bullets that are under meeting 5, defining for us so we have a clear understanding of the distinction between idea submissions, program parameters. I'm just trying to think about as a panel what we're driving for in terms of our deliverable. And we've had some conversations in meetings, but if you could articulate a little bit more around what you see as the deliverables around meeting 5, that'd be helpful.
Well, let me, I'll describe it now, and then I'll probably fast forward a little bit and kind of show you some of the slides that we're going to go through just as an example, just to tie it up in a bow. We don't have here kind of the draft of the recommendation document, but hopefully it'll suffice. So the first bullet, and once again, this would be pre-work for meeting 5 coming out of this meeting. So in this meeting, the panel will have defined the parameters for each program. So saying, as we look at things that would fit into this program, what are the parameters through which we would understand which ones really should fit or not. So that will happen today. In terms of the pre-work, it's going through all the idea submissions and looking at them. We're not going to do it kind of parameter by parameter, but if you were looking at innovation and entrepreneurial ecosystem, and the panel had defined 4 parameters that were important for, say, 30 idea submissions that fell into that area, you would be saying, putting in an H, an M, or an L, looking at those parameters and saying, does it really fit this idea submission based on the parameters that we created? So coming out of that, we'll have a better idea of, out of the idea submissions, which ones really fit within each programmatic area based on how we defined that programmatic area as a panel. So the next one, finalize priorities for minimum and target funding scenarios. So there, at that point, we will have done some work in terms of ranking the programmatic areas, like innovation ecosystem, or talent pipeline, whatever those end up being, and we'll talk about those today. And then saying generally, percentage-wise, an exercise, if I had $100 to spend, how would I allocate them across those? So that could be one, view from the panel in terms of where to allocate funds. Another way of being able to get at that will be to say, let's look at the high fit idea submissions, because when we add all those up, they'll give us an idea of how big that programmatic area could be. So there it would be defining with each one of those what we'd call the funding envelope, is innovation and entrepreneurial ecosystem is our recommendation there, around $80 million as a minimum and 150 as a target. And here are the idea submissions that would fall into each one of those scenarios as inspiration based on kind of how we think about it. And then the last one around discuss key messages for the executive committee will be as the advisory panel puts forward the recommendation that's going to go to the executive committee in terms of here are the programmatic areas, here are the funding envelopes that we recommend, here are the kind of idea submissions that fall into the various funding envelopes. What are the other key messages that go around it in terms of generally upfront thinking about the economic revitalization landscape in Kansas for the Spark Executive Committee to understand in terms of what framed the thinking of the panel, as well as within each one of the program areas. Okay, here's our views on the definition and the target funding in our recommendation for each, as well as what we mean by each of those program areas in terms of goals, description, and the idea submissions that were a good fit for that area. So I'll go through and then you'll see a little bit more of that. But Sam, did that answer your question satisfactorily?
I think so, John. It's getting at this idea of what this advisory panel is trying to achieve. And I think on the programmatic area, it's always been clear. It seems like there's been a little bit of, there's been some discussion around the type of deliverable on the project level deliverable that would be delivered. And it's helpful for me as I think about our deliverable in terms of our objectives and our goal, and making sure that we're aligned with the expectations of the Spark, executive committee. If our deliverable includes, projects that the panel is recommending that fall within those programmatic parameters, that seems to me that we're doing both, right? We're recommending programs, but we're also essentially recommending a slate of projects that fit those parameters because they're ranked at the highest level, and therefore the executive committee can do what they want to do. But if they want, they could take that slate and then proceed at their own will to engage on those specific projects further if they want.
Well, one thing to consider, if you could go up to the funnel slide again. In terms of, once again, these weren't project submissions. They may have had project proposals that were very detailed under them, but they really were ideas, right? Investment ideas, and even the form itself said investment ideas. And they were meant just to be one set of input right from the start. Really, the initial brief, and it was actually built into my job description in terms of what I'm going to be held accountable for at the end of the day. And my contract was to work with the advisory panels based on their judgment to come up with the highest impact areas of investment for Kansas in each one of these areas. And then later to work on program definition what we've done here is we've moved as much specificity as possible into the advisory panels around structuring what those programmatic areas of investments would look like, and even which idea submissions are the highest fit. They still would need to go through a procurement process, and things could fall out and other things might get added in a procurement process. And you'll see as we go in some of these areas, in some of these programmatic areas that have been defined by the panel as being the highest impact investment areas, there aren't even really idea submissions that fit them. So it's going to go up as part of the content, to the Spark Executive Committee, and from them through the State Finance Council and into procurement, those idea submissions. And the good news for those idea submissions, if they're a high fit in their area, has been defined as an area that is high impact for investment, then they have a good shot of getting procured, right? It's just that they were never here. It'd be kind of unfair to call them fully fleshed out projects, because even if you just look through the submissions, some of them are really high level ideas, and some of them you can tell have a much more detailed project definition behind them.
Hey, John, if I could throw my 2 cents in there. Sam, based on my conversations with some of the Spark Executive Committee members, not only do they want programmatic areas, but they would like for us to recommend actual projects that have been submitted and for us to prioritize it. Now, for some reason, this panel decides that, hey, we really want to touch on this particular sector or this particular idea, and no submissions came through as such. We can elevate that too and say, hey, Department of Commerce, go chase this down. This is something that we think is important to our state in regards to economic revitalization. And we didn't get a submission that met that need. And so we want to go chase that down further. That's my understanding of how I'm proceeding. And that's the understanding that I've been given by some of the Spark committee members. Sean, correct, and by all means, I also did miss our meeting, and I've watched the video and everything else, but unless there's been some conversations behind the scenes that have changed, to my knowledge, that's kind of where I'm operating from now. If I need to course correct, then by all means, happy to have that conversation.
Okay, yeah, John, I thought I must have misunderstood our conversation earlier in the week, that I didn't realize that I knew we were going to rank programmatic ideas, then we were going to put sub ideas in there, but I thought that included products.
Well, it'll be all the submissions.
Like actually projects. And I do know that the Spark Committee is expecting, they're going to be the ones picking the projects. And if we can have input on that, we should. I don't think this is going to go to procurement. I know they're telling you that, but the statute that we passed last year that the governor signed says the Spark Committee chooses where the money is spent. There's no procurement going on here other than possibly advisory from the procurement department.
Yeah, I think.
And I think, Mr. Chairman, if I could just kind of add on to what you said. That's obviously I'm one panelist on here, but that's the direction that I've been given as well as serving on this. And I just want to make sure that I don't feel like any of the work that we've done has been futile. I feel I don't want you to take.
You're going in and out, Sam.
We're moving. Is that better, John?
A little bit.
Interrupt me if I start cutting in and out, and I'll try to get a different connection.
No, it's good now.
I was just saying that I appreciate the work that you and the team have done to this point. I think it's all been very productive and fruitful. I just want to make sure that the kind of guidance I've been given as a panelist is aligned with what we're all thinking in terms of this end deliverable, which is like the chairman Chairman Tarwater just articulated, which was we need to be able to turn over a list of recommended projects at the end of the day, not just programmatic areas. And what the executive committee does with those recommendations is their prerogative. But I think we have a responsibility to turn over a robust list of programmatic areas and actual projects that the committee is then able to proceed to fund if they want to, those specific project areas.
And once again, it may be a little bit of a vernacular issue here. We never asked for project submissions. We only asked for idea submissions. And so that's why I keep coming back to idea submissions. But each one of those things, 300 plus that were submitted, that were tagged to economic revitalization, those will, the ones that are the high fit within these programmatic areas will all travel as decided by the advisory panel, will travel out to the Spark executive committee. They're going to see of that list which ones the panel says these are the ones that fit. Yeah, it's just that I don't want to say that they're necessarily projects now, because you would probably ask a few more questions before you fully understood whether they were like projects that could be given an up or down vote at this point, because the form just wasn't that long. Does that make sense?
So it's up to the executive Spark committee to make the final decision. We cannot do that, but we certainly could say, hey, we think these 2 or 3 are pretty good ideas. Why don't you drill down on those? Then they could get they could get the information that they want to make a final decision. But I don't see any harm in doing both ideas and projects that we think are valuable.
Sure. That, like I said, that's a little bit of a change in direction that from what was originally given. All I can say is I know explicitly what was told to me in terms of my roles and responsibilities, and it really honed in on work with the advisory panels around investment areas around which programs would be structured, to the point where like it's built into my contract. But we'll get down to that level of specificity because we're in a position where we can do that. Once again, the specific project approval will need to happen in the right context and procurement, but there'll be a whole lot of specificity around it. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that, and we'll certainly take care of the items that you were to accomplish in your contract, and then we'll tack on some possible ideas for them to look at too. That way, no one's in trouble here.
Yeah, but once again, in some of these programs, we haven't defined the idea submissions don't define the whole scope of what's there, right? And so, the whole universe of what eventually happens won't just be defined by the idea submissions, probably, because there just wasn't an idea submission that captured what we meant. But let's go through it.
We can talk. We can talk more about this offline. In the interest of time, let's move on, because we might, by the end of this meeting, have a better idea of what programmatic ideas we want to really look at. So let's do that first, and then we'll talk individually about ideas.
This meeting might make you feel a lot better about it, or might by the end it might not. Let's go kind of through it and kind of see what we think when we get to the end of it. Keep going. Once again, so these are the principles that the panel put forward, which a lot of cases kind of reflected the principles, rightly so, that the Spark Executive Committee had put forward around, address high needs, and I'd say opportunities there with catalytically impactful ideas. Investment should be made in areas that have largely allowable programs and existing funding is insufficient. Avoid establishing programs requiring ongoing funding, and leverage existing frameworks and programs that can be utilized to implement one-time funding. It was kind of like, don't try and kind of recreate something totally separate. If you can kind of ride some resources or, centers of gravity that already exist, do so. So don't recreate wheels unnecessarily if you don't have to. Go to the next slide. Next slide. So this is a little bit of kind of the trail of breadcrumbs around the programmatic areas. And this is based on the polling that the panelists had done, and some of the shaping the panelists, insights the panelists had given, over the course of the sessions and in between. So we had a lot of list of prioritized programmatic areas. Then based on the polling, really started focusing on a few. And then the ones that we're going to work through today, we did like a slight bit of shaping around them that I'll point out. But there are 6 of these: innovation and entrepreneurial ecosystem. Second is programs to grow and support industries. And what we ended up doing was moving cybersecurity as a subpoint in that, because holding it out as something totally separate, particularly based on the discussions from last time, didn't make sense, because that's almost kind of like a use case of programs to grow and support industries. Worker training programs, talent pipeline programs, and that was one that had been defined, that people had voted on. It included staff retention, attraction. And based on the discussion last time, we think this was really more strategic talent pipeline within Kansas, as opposed to kind of tactical, kind of one business at a time kind of retention type efforts. So we'll talk a little bit more about what that could mean and make sure that we get the group's input about how they think about what it means, as we're defining it, and how important that would be. Housing development and rehabilitation, we put those 2 things together. They've been separate before. General water and sewer infrastructure and building improvements and construction. And that really was more around kind of infrastructure improvement to support economic development. So once again, we'll get into it in more detail as we go. But these are the 6 areas that, based on the polling and then just a little bit of shaping, we focused the bulk of these materials on for us to talk through. Go to the next slide. So in the ranking of the programmatic areas in terms of the meeting for input survey, looking at kind of the votes that came in at 1, 2, 3, 4, if we look at kind of how each one of these 7 areas stack up against each other, this was kind of how they stacked up. So, and then we also show in the second column the number of idea submissions and then the associated funding with those idea submissions, just to give people a feeling for kind of, in terms of idea submissions, what's housed within each one of those areas. And so you see the thing that bubbled to the top, based on the views of the panel, were programs to grow and support industries, in particular, kind of targeted at industries that could be real growth industries for the state. The second one was innovation and entrepreneurial ecosystem. Then the kind of strategic talent pipeline programs, building improvements and construction. Once again, these are kind of things that are kind of town square type programs that could drive economic development. Housing development and rehabilitation, and then a little bit of a drop down to general water and sewer infrastructure and worker training programs, which probably reflects, quite frankly, kind of the tenor of some of the discussions that happened earlier. But let me stop here for a second, because we're just the support team. This doesn't reflect our views at all. This needs to kind of reflect where the energy of the group is and the judgment of the panel is. So anyone surprised by any of this or in line? Anyone have any thoughts?
I'm a little surprised with more people interested in innovation and entrepreneurial ecosystem.
Representative Terrell, I'll say you're definitely going in and out, so didn't pick up much of what you just said.
I think what this is Matt Conn, I think what he was saying was he was surprised more people didn't vote for innovation entrepreneurial ecosystem. I would say, I agree. Although I will also say we had a struggle here. I don't know if other committee members had the same issue. We had a security issue getting through to the survey. So I'm not sure that my submission, raising my hand, is one of the members that voted. I'm not sure it went through. We had security issues getting that done. So I would say, with regard to the survey responses, To those of us that weren't, maybe we should revisit that issue specifically, because I know I sent a message in. I don't know if it came across, but we were struggling to get to that. I would agree though with the sentiment. I continue to think that in the sense that we were asked to sit on this committee to do really bold and meaningful things that have long-term impact on the state of Kansas, the amount of space or the amount of opportunity there in that space, specifically around innovation and entrepreneurial ecosystem, to me, this is just one member, feels immensely important to lean in on, but I'll stand down for other comments.
Just one point on that, Matt, is that we've developed kind of programmatic templates against each one of these, and we'll get feedback and all that.
Great.
But we're going to revisit this prioritization exercise in a couple of days. And so I think it's going to be really important once to make sure that we do get everyone's votes. And then we're also going to redo it within each one of these areas around the fit of the idea submissions. So,
great. Thank you. I was speaking for Representative Tarwater. I may have got that wrong. So I hate to say that, because now that he's got his mic back on, maybe he can tell me if I misspoke.
No, you nailed it. I'm trying to get to a better area so you can hear me.
That we just heard you pretty well then, Representative Tarwater. So anyone have any other thoughts on this slide? Once again, we'll revisit it, but this was just kind of based on the info that the team had received, just kind of the general view that we'd gotten from the feedback. And once again, we'll do some things that go into some other exercises. Once again, if you had $100 to spend, how would you think about it relatively? And
yeah, this is Lana, and I just, again, I can't stress enough how important, I know you guys are tired of hearing me say it, but the housing development piece is just so important. Every industry we talk to is short on people. So the idea of growing the ecosystem and growing industry in our state without paying attention to how the heck we're going to meet their workforce needs. And that is not workforce training. That is workforce placement. That is getting them into our state, getting them into our communities. I just can't stress enough how important that piece is in my mind. As we go forward, we just can't lose sight of the fact that right now, we don't have the workers in the state, and it's not like they're sitting on unemployment or sitting anywhere else. We have the data. We can back that up. We need more people. We have a people problem in Kansas, and we have got to find ways to get more people living in our state, living in our communities, and sharing in the economic opportunities that we're looking to create.
Yeah, so Lana, we put last week in appropriations, we put $50 million into, or another $50 million into housing. And I know that leadership is working on a mega housing type bill to kind of include a little bit of everything on top of that. So we're trying to address the housing. It is an important issue.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
great. Awesome. Well, with that, let's continue to walk through these. Okay, so we're going to go through the program templates. Once again, this slide in terms of kind of an overview template describing the programmatic area almost is like the cover slide for each one of these. We won't spend a lot of time on these at this point. We're kind of building to them, and everyone will have a chance to go through them eventually. There are a couple slides though in each one of these sections that are really kind of better areas for discussion. So this is just a reminder, we've been kind of showing this format for a while. So go to the next slide. And once again, the other thing that we've been looking at in each one of these is trying to profile each one in terms of impact and feasibility as a way of being able to look across the programmatic areas with, some level of consistency. So, we talk about these terms quite a bit as we are fleshing out each one of the programmatic areas. Go to the next slide. So at a high level, and we probably should spend some time on this before going into each one of the areas. And once again, these definitions, these descriptions, this was kind of from the work, listening to the previous sessions, from the input of the group, continuing to kind of work to try and flesh these out. the description should really reflect what the panel wants at the end of the day, right? But this is kind of at a top level, the descriptions of each one of these areas, all the way from programs to grow and support industries down through general water and sewer infrastructure. So we'll get a chance to kind of go through each one of these one at a time and make sure they reflect the panel's views. But this is kind of where they all are in one place. Once again, the idea submissions have been filtered to fit into one of these programs. Okay, keep going. So once again, not going to spend a lot of time on these slides. Eventually, you know, the panel will have all their fingerprints all over it, and all the stuff we worked through will have literally just filtered up into this. But in programs to grow and support industries, go to the next slide. And I'm going to have folks look at this. And so look at the description, the program description as it is defined now. And once again, this is kind of general goals, target outcomes. The intent wouldn't be at this point to put the numbers in here, but I'll let everyone spend a couple minutes reading this, and then let's have a discussion to say, I think it's off here. I would change this, or you're missing this. So, because once again, this needs to reflect the panel's view. So I'll give people maybe a 12:42 or so, read through it, and then we'll have a discussion. And once again, the next slide is going to go into more detail and more specificity about this, as well as to, you know, we'll go through the exercise of the panel defining the program parameters against this to guide panelist ratings, you know, after this of the idea submissions, and that will move forward and inform future procurement and project selection. So on this slide, I guess I'd open it up. Thoughts? Is it off? Where's it off? What should we change? What are we missing?
Hey, John, it's Ryan. I think it's pretty spot on. I guess one question I have is the very first word, grant program. I thought that, you know, at some point in time, we had some conversation about industry and partners putting some skin in the game. So is, you know, what in my terms, or in my view, I guess a grant is just a straight grant to the industry. Is there going to be any cost share conversation at some point?
Yeah, I kind of don't even like the technical term grant, because it's not just like giving free money out. You'll see actually even on the next slide, it's basically says in the program parameters that you can ask for a match, right? That the team had thrown in some kind of illustrative parameters and said, hey, one parameter could be around the program is ensure financial stability, sustainability, and fiduciary responsibility with a 25% match and risk assessments of grantees, right? So once again, it can be with whatever the panel wants to put forward as a parameter, but Brett.
Yeah, the title is Grow and Support Industries, and then the language is program that creates hub for new employers. Does that
Yep.
suggest that this is somebody who isn't already in the state, or would this also encompass something that might allow an existing employer to expand their operations and their employee base? Or do we intentionally call out new employers as some industry or business that isn't here now?
You know, when I read this one, good catch, Brett, I almost thought that two things should have been bolded. I thought the hubs for new employers of the future to enter Kansas, and then funds industry-driven initiatives that create sustained, regionally impactful jobs should have also been bolded, because then it actually talks to both. But I'll open it up. I thought the impression I got from the group before was really this was around enabling investments of, you know, growth industries for Kansas, many of which would be existing industries.
That's what I'm thinking. I just want to make sure that altogether this language, I mean, attracting a new business or employer seems like fair game, but also allowing for meaningful and, significant expansion of existing industry and employers would make sense as well.
Got it, Brett. I'm assuming other people probably agree with that.
Yeah, I agree with Brett. And John, as you described it, I think had that next phrase been bolded, I would have interpreted this differently. But I agree that I think the program description, whether we take away the bold or add another bold, should definitely be inclusive of Kansas businesses and employers, and not just kind of make it sound like it's an external to Kansas employer that is eligible for this.
Yep. And I saw Ryan and Lana giving me the digital thumbs up. Thank you. So I'm assuming people are good with that kind of recrafting of this, just to make sure that's clear.
Yeah, John. So when I look at helping an industry, I look at helping an industry rather than individual companies in the industry. And the way this is kind of set up is people would apply. It looks like people would apply for grants, and you would be giving a limited amount of companies money. I would favor things like our aviation tax credit that we're working on right now, that hopefully will pass this year, that benefits the entire industry and keeps our kids in Kansas after they graduate, because currently over 60% of them leave, and that's a big problem. And that's our manpower right there. And if we can give tax credits to them to stay in the particular industry that we want to target, and if we can give tax credits to an industry, then that's money that we would never earn anyway, because it's against future income that for people that are leaving the state. And then you got to think of it as far as like programs within our community colleges and technical schools that would help these types of industries that we could get our students into, so that we have the manpower to grow that industry, rather than, I'm more into putting money towards an industry than I am individual companies. It just makes more sense to me. That's just me though. Yep.
Well, let's I hear you. On the next slide, let's see if, as we go into that and we think
John,
about.
John, this is Andrew Nave. If you wouldn't mind throwing in my 2 cents. And I agree with everything that's been said. I guess the tone that I take on kind of industry support, and I think it's referenced here, but would be the forward-looking elements of our industries. And I love the fact that the goals and targeted outcomes references the framework for growth. But how do we encourage in this that each of our industries have areas of innovation that we need to push our state, push our industries, and push our companies towards those segments? So I think within, Sam can speak to it far better than I can, but within aerospace, defense, and UAV, and the cutting edge areas of aerospace, and within agriculture, precision farming. So how do we take if there is a way to just underscore, or maybe bold, that it's not just necessarily that these are our major industries that are core to our economy, but that it's encouraging these industries to look forward and to lean forward as opposed to just, supporting them, what they've been doing for decades. So I know that's kind of inferred here, but I would absolutely encourage it's the cutting edge is what we're going for.
Yep. Well, and the interesting thing is going to be between this programmatic area is defined and then the entrepreneurial and innovation ecosystem and then the talent pipeline. There's going to be some thematic themes that we're going to just need to figure out, which areas are focused on which aspects of the opportunity probably. But I hear you on that. Yep. Let's go to the next slide. And I'm going to be really interested to hear what you guys have to say on this. So why don't we take a couple minutes, or maybe three or 4 minutes and read the left around, this is almost kind of putting forward the argument and saying that focusing on this would be a high impact and the feasibility is a medium. We can change those, if people think so, and some of the points around that below. So we can tweak or shift any of those things based on the panel's view. And then on the right, and this, once again, these are just meant to be illustrative to get kind of the juices flowing for people to think about this, is on the right, we should come up with the 2, 3, 4, 5 principles that the advisory panel thinks are really important for deciding where within this area the state should spend money. And once again, that can be used to, and it will be used to rate the current idea submissions, as well as, any other ideas that, may not have been covered by those idea submissions that could have been important here too. So I'll stop talking. I'll give people a few minutes to absorb this and then we can discuss. All right, if anyone's kind of gotten done with the left-hand side, anyone wants to kind of weigh in with some of their thoughts, think something's off, wrong, something's missing. One thing I will say too here though is we've kind of geared on the impact side. The scope obviously is just really important because it defines what we're talking about here. But things like the duration and ongoing investment needs under the feasibility were really important things that we really wanted to focus on because they key into some of the guiding principles, right? So we have to know how they fit there. And one of the guiding principles for the Spark Executive Committee was around considering equity. So we put in something there to think about how the program could be shaped as well, just in terms of answering the mail towards what the Spark Executive Committee asked for. But once again, at the end of the day, this really should reflect what the panel thinks and wants. So any thoughts on that left-hand side?
I have a question and a comment. I'll get them both out and then be quiet. And maybe I'm just reading this wrong. I'm trying to understand short-term duration, 1 to 2 years to accelerate industry growth, but limited long-term sustainability. Guess I'm trying to understand that why that's a factor. Limited long-term sustainability.
I think we should probably. The impact here is high. I don't think it was saying that the impacts won't be sustained in the long term. I think it was the fact that let's make it the investment catalytic. More,
I
so
see.
that was more defining the program. So I just think we should clarify that because I think that's a good catch, Matt. That wasn't the intent.
Yeah, another one I would just say, and again, I'll say it now, I think focusing on industries that Kansas dominates, I think is important, or is relevant and is important. Although I would say, this ecosystem is changing so rapidly that there's opportunities to enter and dominate new marketplaces that maybe Kansas traditionally hasn't, that we should just be open to. And I guess, there's and some of those industries that are, as the world has evolved, opened up the opportunity for Kansas to be a significant player in. It would be a tragedy if we didn't lean in when the opportunity presented, to develop new markets that Kansas dominates as part and parcel of this experience. So maybe it's in here.
Yeah,
I don't want to we're good at, but it's relevant.
Well, the second part of the scope, identify industries in the future, electric vehicles may not have been the best example to throw out there, to ensure Kansas has a plan to grow and support. Representative Tarwater.
Yeah, I think to answer the question on limited sustainability is around the fact that we want to try to keep these investments as one time, and then the industry would sustain it after that. So, kind of like investing in infrastructure for buildings or whatever it is that would train individuals or training places, or like the K-State thing that I think we all received this week, more information on for, different industries type things that we would make an investment, they would match it, and then it would run from there without future spark dollars or SGF money, state general fund money. Sorry.
Yeah, but we should clean up that language there under duration for sure. Ryan?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Lana. Ryan's had his hand raised. Well, I'll get back to you.
So, sorry, Lana. I agree with the comments that have been made, but I do want to double down on the industries that Kansas dominates. I mean, we've got a number of those, and I certainly want to make sure we continue to feed that beast, because I think that's where innovation really takes off if you've already got a base level of that happening in the state. So that's really important. And then, John, one thing on the feasibility comment there, the workability, feasibility, I mentioned this in one of our previous meetings. I guess I'm less interested in new programs unless it really, truly makes sense. I think even currently, but even if you look back in history, Kansas has done a great job of creating some of these programs, whether it's at the Department of Commerce or elsewhere. So if we can already feed into an existing structure, rather than creating a whole new apparatus, that's something that I would certainly support. So that's just a comment down there on the feasibility comment.
Got it. Lana, sorry.
Well, it's great. My comment was around kind of the same thing that Ryan just brought up. I struggle with not having input beyond the panel. Just giving the recommendation and then handing it off to a state agency. That quite frankly brings me a little bit of consternation, just because they're not necessarily going to look for those innovative ideas and find ways to make those work. And so I would really encourage this group to put parameters in place that require that and that have some accountability for that. What I don't want this to be is just more money that goes into existing state agencies, and we hope that somehow they have a paradigm shift and recognize that there are much bigger opportunities than what they've funded in the past.
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, to a certain extent, once again, the advisory panel is going to be able to, whatever parameters are put forward here, be able to apply them to the existing idea submissions. But I think to your point, Lana, there's the things that may not be reflected in the existing idea submissions. And you want to make sure any investments beyond those kind of reflect something that truly is going to be kind of pushing the envelope. All right. So I hear you. Well, if people are okay, let's move to
John, I'm gonna make two quick comments. To Lana's point, I think that kind of comes back to some of this conversation around what we're driving at, which is not necessarily, if it's not necessarily driving toward, dumping a bunch of money into an existing grant program and kind of walking away, but it's how can we make sure that we're making recommendations that are meaningful towards specific projects with outcomes that leverage inputs from this panel to then help the Spark Executive Committee make informed decisions and do with the recommendation what they see best. And then a comment that was made by a few people before. The way that I think about it, especially with Ryan's comment, the way that I think about it is we've got core industries in Kansas right now. And it seems like this proposal with this programs to grow and support industries is all about creating that continued organic growth with existing industries. And we're not taking away from any of the focus or the push to help with the organic growth of existing industries. But at the same time, we want to expand the other portions of the pie that include new industries and emerging industries that don't necessarily exist or that exist with a very small footprint today, so that as a total pie, we're seeing a larger portion maybe in those new and innovative areas. But that doesn't mean that we're diminishing or taking away from current industry growth.
Yeah. Hopefully the scope actually line gets at that. I mean, I actually felt that it did a fairly good job of capturing both points where it said focused on industries Kansas dominates and identify industries of the future to ensure Kansas has a plan to grow and support. So, well, can we move to the right side, and I'll let people take a look at that for, the next couple of minutes, and then we really should spend a good amount of time hearing this out just to make sure that in people's minds, once again, you'll be looking at the idea submissions against whatever we create here to say, hey, which ones are the ones out of those idea submissions we put forward, but they also would be parameters that would look at kind of whatever gets focused on in this area. So,
just to clarify, the right side to look at this screen aligns with question number 2. The right side is supposed to be the parameters.
Yeah, the right side is the illustrative parameters. Yeah,
Thank
they're the parameters that would help define what resides in this area. Yeah. Mm-hmm. What should be focused on and how, basically. And once again, all of these are just meant to be illustrative, just to get you thinking. Really, if the 5 things that end up here, or 4 or 3 or whatever, end up being none of these, that's fine too. So,
John, just so I'm clear, could you describe the intention of the last bullet about the 25% match? Like what limitation that's putting on the things that we may end up ranking?
Once again, these are all totally illustrative. So it can be wherever the panel thinks to be. The thought on that one was, and I think there were kind of 2 concepts here. One is around, the fact that there will need to be, when you get into project procurement eventually, some risk assessment, right, to understand all the things that go into project procurement. The second one, though, in the match was kind of looking for something where there is some joint risk taking, and cost share between whoever is getting the money as well as the state around these things. So just to make sure that, and once again, it put down a 25% match. Maybe it could be more fluid than that. I don't know. But that was the thought around that one. And once again, this may be 2 points, and maybe you guys don't agree on either of the points, but let's kind of hear what your thoughts are.
John, this is Tim. So I agree with that last sentence. I'm still a little unclear. I mean, are you asking them to have at least a 25% match, or that we are only putting in at least 25% into the project? I'm with the last.
Once again, these are illustrative. Fine with totally taking it off if it doesn't make sense to anyone. I believe it was a cost share of asking the people who are getting the grant to fund up to 25% of whatever the ultimate project is.
John, no, I like it. I mean, I like the idea that, someone have some skin in the game, at least, that we're not funding the entire initiative. So I guess if that's what you're trying to achieve here, then I like that idea. I just didn't know,
Sure.
you know, is 25% the number
Yeah.
or, yeah, and I get, we're trying to figure that out.
Yeah, well, let me get into that a little bit. I guess should this one be based on the panel's view defined as, you know, structure procurement so that there's skin in the game for the, you know, people receiving the grants or the funding?
Yeah, John, that might have been something that I put in my answer. And the reason I did was because actually J.R. Clays is on this call too. He and I were talking earlier in the week when we were together that a lot of these submissions that came in through this program were also submitted to our base program, which requires a match. And when they submitted them to us, they would submit $400,000. And then when they submitted them to the base, it was the same program, but they would say they would pay 100,000 and we would pay 300,000. So
Okay.
I think that it's important just to find out what kind of match, rather than say a 25% match, how much are they pitching in on the same project, so that when they make their decision, you know, in the executive committee, they can know that, okay, hey, we're going to put in this, but they are already putting in all this other stuff. And then the risk assessment part is, it's important to know the background of the people that are making these submissions, because we want to make sure that they're good business people that can make things work and not just blow a bunch of money.
Okay. Yeah, we may want to make that kind of 2 points, just because, I mean, I agree that they all happen, but okay. Well, let me ask, just in the interest of kind of working down the list, the first illustrative one, support targeted investments that drive catalytic growth in industries of the future and diversify the Kansas economy. People good with that? Yeah. Should there be
I would say, John, I think they're both equally important. It's the industries of the future, whether, and I think it was Matt that said maybe it's industries we don't have today, or it's new realms within industries that are existing in Kansas, but it's those industries themselves evolving. But then the diversifying is equally important. So I like the way you have that.
Should we add a second one then around support targeted investments that will drive catalytic and growth within existing industries in innovative spaces or something?
Well,
like that?
I think it's somewhat inferred that it's new or existing, but if you wanted to wordsmith it, I think it's fine either way.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we could add them both, as this can cover both. We'll make sure it covers both. The second one, prioritize investments that will provide large scale immediate impact, training facilities, lab spaces, scale up networks. Is that right in intent, but wrong in wording? What do people think about that one?
I think they need to take a close look at that. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, please, go ahead.
I think it's important to take a close look at that. I mean, there were a few submissions in there around cybersecurity. There was one school that wanted to ramp up their program, and they put people in businesses in Kansas, and those people will end up working in Kansas for those companies usually, because they're in those businesses to learn. Then there was another group, I think, up in the Kansas City area that their submission kind of drew out an evergreen type situation where they would use the future monies to fund future programs. And so I think that's important, to have an immediate large scale impact that will be kind of an evergreen type deal. And training facilities and lab spaces would do that.
Any other thoughts?
I think my comment was in line on that one. Also, that I love the idea of prioritizing large scale impact. Although, I mean, this is the problem too. You wordsmith this. We could do this for years and not get anywhere. I wouldn't want to do that. But some investments may have a longer but more profound impact, over time. And I would hate to not. I mean, it's a prioritization issue. But those that maybe are a slower but more profound long-term impact, I think should carry significant weight as well. And so again, but I understand the want for immediate impact for sure as well. And so it's a delicate dance, I guess.
Okay. We'll just have to make sure that we word it so you got the right kind of balance there around it. Yep. What about the third one around provide geographic equity of investments while ensuring support for communities with economic need? I mean, do you want to make that one of the parameters or not?
What does that mean exactly? Geographic equity. So we're talking about across the whole state, like from like literally, like, I guess I'm not exactly sure I even know what that means.
Yeah. So often what happens is we look past the rural communities and we really, they have a huge dairy going in out there that they're going to need a lot of support in, a lot of houses for their jobs. And so it's important to not overlook the rural areas, because as we saw in this last census, we gained 2 seats in Johnson County, another one in Sedgwick County, and lost 3 in Western Kansas as far on the House of Representatives side because of the census. And I'd like to see that trend reversed. And it's important to fund those communities' needs too.
I would. This is Tim McKee. I agree with Representative Tarwater that we need to make sure that there's some equity there.
Okay. Well, let me ask a question now. And we'll kind of do some of the shaping we talked about, particularly on the last one. We'll reflect what your thoughts are. I see you, Brett. I'll get to you in a second. And also, is there anything that's missing here? Think about that in terms of that you would want to think of as important parameter. Before we go into that, Brett, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, I just say on the geographic equity piece, the tricky thing about that is, of course, there's multiple committees evaluating and ranking proposals in all different areas. Eventually, it's going to roll up to the executive committee. And certainly at the individual proposal level, any individual proposal might appear to have a limited geographic impact and scope within the state. So at some level, you would like it, the area, the idea of geographic equity to be honored. I think that's important, and that we consider that. But I don't know if we should be balancing it here, or if we should just trying to bring the best proposals to the executive committee and let them massage that and balance that. I mean, I think it's something we can consider, but I don't know that we can ultimately figure that one out, and because of other committees considering other things and all that. But
yeah, that was a little bit why I asked on this one, Brett. That's a good point. It's if you actually put something in and said, okay, make one of the parameters that it supported rural Kansas, which is really, admirable thing to do. There's obvious needs and opportunity there. But if you rated every single one by that, then you might just get all things in rural Kansas, as opposed to trying to maybe looking at it a little bit like extra credit. And at the end of the day, you can look at the overall portfolio and make some decisions on the margin, right? So the question is, do you want it to be a specific parameter here, or something to have an eye out for as you kind of walk through things? You don't want it to be a hard knockout factor for sure, right? And one thing to keep in mind too is we're just going to ask everyone against the parameters in general, not each one specifically. Do you think generally is this idea submission a high, a medium, or a low, right? So from an idea submission standpoint, just because an area could be a huge idea, maybe not in an area, a community of need, but it's a huge idea, and nevertheless, you wouldn't want it to get eliminated because of that one parameter. Anyway, Matt, you're unmuted, so I don't know if you were going to make a comment.
Oh, no. Well, I guess, sorry. Glad you told me that before. No, I think that same kind of idea goes into, I think, the last one, and I know maybe we're getting to that one, so I didn't mean to jump ahead, but I think the 25% match, and I know that was illustrative, so I'm not suggesting, but I do think I understand the point of that, although I think that the same thing you just said, John, there may be some programs in rural or underserved communities that can't do a match. And we wouldn't want that to be a factor in not considering it. So I do think maybe it gives it more, but I do think having some flexibility with that language is important. And then the last thing I would say about the fourth one is that's where my confusion about the duration, limited short-term sustainability seem to contradict ensuring financial sustainability. And so I know we just have to work that language and make it make sense, but that's where I was confused, I guess, by those 2 points. And it's just worrying, but I also understand Representative Tarwater about we're going to make a impactful investment. So it's wording.
Well, let me say, in the interest of time, we can continue to kind of wordsmith this and work on it based on the input. And we have a few more programs to go through, I guess. But before kind of jumping forward to the next one, I just want to make sure, does anyone have any view of we're just totally missing something or getting something wrong here? Okay, well, let's move to the next one then. Once again, this is more of it'll be important in the end, but it's more of a placeholder for now. We're going into innovation and entrepreneurial ecosystem. So go to the next slide. So same drill. Take a couple minutes and read through what's on the left. And, let's have a discussion and say, hey, once again, tried to create this based on previous discussions, but let's make sure that this reflects everyone's thinking. So. All right. Anyone with any thoughts or comments on this as written, or suggestions about how to improve? You got to have some thoughts here, man.
Again, I think the numbers are kind of just in there for placeholders, right?
Yeah. Yes. Sure. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess from my standpoint, I think this is one of those areas where we really need to focus on making sure that our existing private sector is tied to these. I've seen across the state the incubator concepts that communities think it's going to be their next big win. They put in an incubator and it's a great place for business startup, and 5 years later the same businesses are still operating. I mean, it just really became a mall, if you will, and nothing transformative happened as a result of those investments. I think what makes the difference and what's really going to spur the innovation and the entrepreneurial side is if it's not just, hey, here's a building and we equipped it with some high-speed internet and a joint conference room that you can all use, but instead ensuring that we're bringing our existing successful industries into that process so that they are supportive of what's happening within those walls, and so that they're engaged in it and actually encouraging the kind of innovation and the kind of entrepreneurial efforts that really will bring systemic change.
Yeah, got it. Well, the other thing that could flow in here too could be innovation at higher ed too. So there's a few different threads in here, and my guess, Matt, you probably even have other ideas. So
I feel like I've already talked too much in this meeting, so I'm going to try to respect that. I think where there's the real piece there is the resources and funding for startups. That is to me the most important 5 words in there, or the most impactful potentially, and also the most problematic 5 words in that program description that we will really need to spend some time on what that means what we're aiming at, the impact we're looking to have, the risk we're willing to take. We've had some history in Kansas around this kind of idea, and I think I just think that's a specific area that is potentially really impactful, but also really important to focus on. And so that's my one comment.
Representative Tarwater, you look like you were unmuting.
Yeah, I agree with Matt on that. I would like to make a note, at least in there, that we'd want to tie at least some of it to collegiate, our university's research, because that's a good way to start good businesses. The professors are really good at doing research, but they're not good business people. And so if we could team up small entrepreneur startup companies with researchers in our universities, kind of like KU's Innovation Campus does, they've had a lot of success with that. And so it might be important to note that might be a good idea to continue.
Yeah. Got it. Any other thoughts on this before we go to the second slide that gets more into the parameters? And all right, let's go to the second slide. So same drill, take a couple minutes, look at the left-hand side, make sure that it makes sense. It's kind of what people think. And then, you can look at what we have illustratively on the right-hand side. But, we really want to make sure that reflects your thoughts around that. So give it a couple minutes. So any thoughts or suggestions on what's on the left-hand side of the slide?
I have a couple things. First of all, I think done right, I think the duration is probably better than medium-term impact. If we do these right, they should be an ongoing source of entrepreneurs and new industry for the state. The second piece of that, the workability, feasibility, Department of Commerce has certainly had some experience in this area, but the Network Kansas programming is far more aligned with what we're talking about with entrepreneurs. And I would push back on, again, throwing the money into the Department of Commerce, and would be far more supportive of utilizing the organization that's been supporting entrepreneurs and innovation along the way.
Check. Got it. Any other thoughts?
Lana took my Network Kansas position. I totally agree. I think that's a better place. And then I just, and again, not to labor this, I think there's a real opportunity here to think big and make really big, impactful moves. Although I think there's a lot of risk as well that we'd have to navigate. But there are some examples of efforts like this that we could parallel. And so, I think there's an even way to think even bigger about some of the impact and how we do it, and model some successful efforts that have happened with government funds. And so I'll just put a bookmark in that. But Lana was right about Network Kansas.
Got it. Okay. Now let's go to the right-hand side. So any thoughts when you look at this? And I know that some of this was from feedback and comments from individual panel members on. So let's just talk about the first one: prioritize infrastructure and support projects that will drive new economic development across Kansas. I'm just kind of curious as to whether infrastructure is hard infrastructure, or infrastructure is meant to be, it sits at the ecosystem level. So anyway, what thoughts do people have around that one?
Hey, John, it's Ryan. I kind of go back to a comment I think that Lana even made earlier. This is the chicken and the egg situation. And if we don't have some hard infrastructure, obviously housing, but even broadband, and I know the connectivity panel is working on that, we just have to have some hard infrastructure in order to get some of this entrepreneurship and innovation in a lot of parts of the state.
Okay, so in the context of this, in terms of kind of what was this, that would be more like the incubation facilities and stuff like that?
Yep.
Anyone else have any other thoughts on the things on the right in terms of doesn't make sense, doesn't fit, is worded differently than I would, missing something?
On the second bullet, John, this is Andrew Nave. On the second bullet point on focus investments, I absolutely agree with innovation and high tech, but I don't know if that captures it all. I guess I would, just as kind of an old school economic developer, kind of lean back on kind of more the basic industries or our primary industries, the industries that they're bringing dollars into our state and exporting their sales. I wouldn't want to exclusively limit that to the IT sector per se, although we all wholeheartedly agree that the tech is going to be where a lot of these entrepreneurial ideas come from. But I guess I would just enhance that. That absolutely has to be about innovation and tech, but that there could be some really cool investments that need to come from some of our primary industries.
Got it. Yeah, I think. So how would we change the wording on that, do you think?
Yeah, and again, maybe it's just the way I'm reading it. It just kind of jumps off the page to me as this is, maybe this is focusing on just the technology sector. And again, technology threads across every industry. So maybe it's just broadening that to not just high tech IT is what I mean.
Yep.
Yeah, but I would say, some of the comments made earlier about, just we can't ignore the stuff we're already really good at, right? We can't ignore agriculture, we can't ignore aviation. And I feel like that maybe is, I would agree with Andrew. It feels, as long as one of us is there to explain what was meant by the wording, I guess maybe it's safe. But the idea that this is going to go out to somebody else and they're going to be judging their decisions based on what they think this means, I think that's dangerous, because I think it ignores the things that we're already really good at and need to continue to support.
Yeah, it's almost like innovation driven and future forward related projects or something like that, right? Maybe a little bit broader. Good. Award grants to well-established organizations to ensure investments are sustainable. Does that need to be in there or not?
Yeah, I don't know that necessarily needs to be in there. I mean, I think that we need to make sure that funds are going to organizations that are going to be using the funds wisely.
Yeah.
But that kind of, the way it's written now, it sounds like unless you've been here for a long time, you're not really eligible, which I don't think is the message that we're wanting to send.
I agree. Completely agree with Sam. To me, that is so counterintuitive to say that we're trying to encourage new innovation and new players to come to the table, but you have to already be well established before we'll give you any money. That point makes no sense at all to me.
There's inherent risk whenever you're talking about an entrepreneurial ecosystem, and so we have to be smart with how the funds are recommended to be used. But you're not going to eliminate risk entirely, and we've got to think a little bit bigger here.
Okay.
Hey, John, I think the spirit there is more of like award grants to individuals or organizations that ensure a certain level of success and ability to implement is what you're trying to capture there versus something that's established, right?
Yep. They get a plan. Mm-hmm. You would theoretically think that should exist in every single program, but yeah.
And John, I'll move on to the next one, and I didn't capture it at the last slide, but I think it applies to both on kind of the matching And this is a little more, this slide is a little more explicit than the last one that says it requires a minimum of 25%.
Yeah.
I guess I would kind of prioritize higher matches. I mean, how do we encourage, if that's what we're trying to do is ensure sustainability or to spread the equity of this to as many good projects as we can, to be as efficient as we can, how do we prioritize higher matches without giving a percentage or a minimum or requirement? Because I think Matt or someone mentioned earlier, I would sure hate to turn down, or whoever this gets passed to, turn out a good idea because there isn't a match. But if we can just reword that to a prioritizing that, would be, I think would be better.
Right. Yep.
And John and Sean, correct me if I'm wrong, but whenever we end up sending our final list up to the Spark Committee, it's not just going to be a deck that we send and none of us are there to be represented to ask any questions. I would imagine at a minimum, John, you would be there, and then also our chair would be there to field any questions from the exec committee to provide any color commentation or clarifying.
Yeah,
that's right.
The intent would be that you and Representative Tarwater would present. I'll be there. And that, there will be a discussion and there could be some questions and asks. And we're doing it like in April so that there's still time to be able to have discussion and information flowing back between the panel and the executive committee, to kind of answer any questions. So there could be another meeting of the advisory panel after the recommendation goes up.
Perfect. I just wanted to clarify that for the rest of the panelists as well, and myself.
Yep.
I just want to add on to what Andrew said. I like the idea of incentivizing matches from the private sector so that we leverage these tax dollars for the maximum economic benefit. And so rather than thinking about a floor or a minimum of a match, how can we begin to think about really driving incentives to have higher level matches?
Yeah, I was thinking of it almost as appropriate co-investment. Well, anyway, we'll continue to kind of wordsmith that, but before, is there anything missing?
I guess I would like to see us in all of these be giving some extra points, if you will, for projects that reach across the scope. I get that. An example, 3D printed housing. That should get, to me, in my mind, should get a higher prioritization for funding because it's working against a housing concern. Obviously, it could be a great solution for that, but it's also an innovative industry that's consistently changing, and there's opportunities for the state to cabbage onto that as a new technology and an innovation thing. So I'd like to see us maybe just that's something included on everyone, is if it's something that addresses another one of the identified needs, it should get a little higher scoring.
Yeah, got it. And if it could be a broad enabler, right, it can raise a lot of votes. Yep, got it. All right. Well, once again, in the interest of time, we'll incorporate all this. Let's move to the next one. This is the talent pipeline programs. Let's go to the next slide. And Sandra will take a couple minutes to look at this and make sure we're kind of, capturing it or not. And once again, in some of these, we've taken input from so many different panelists individually and went back to kind of what we heard in the sessions and talked with others that, we may not have triangulated on some of these rights. So take a look and then let's talk about it. And the numbers at the bottom are kind of illustrative at this point. Any thoughts on this? Once again, this ended up being kind of, I think it covers a lot of things, different things, but the intent here was to really get at kind of strengthening the strategic talent pipeline. And so any thoughts on this?
I think that this slide applies all the way across to all the other things we've talked about. But I'd like to know how the committee feels about helping employee retention for a company versus providing talent for an industry. It just seems like if a company wants to come up with programs of its own to incentivize their employees to stay and they can sustain it, then they need to do that. If we do that for them, and this is one-time funding, how are they going to sustain that? And their employees are going to leave. And so I think the current employers part of it needs to be more of a up to them type deal. But that's just my opinion. I'd like to see what the rest of the committee kind of thinks about that.
Mm-hmm.
I would agree, Representative Tarwater. I think maybe it's a better focus to put these funds in cooperation with private industry to help them start these programs, knowing that they're going to have to replace the funding that's being put in it from our side at some point, so that they make a plan for that. But I would agree. I think these, again, as with all of these, I just think it's so important that we're bringing that private sector. The public sector should not try to solve the problems of the private sector, because we're not good at that. And we've proven that time and time again. The best thing we can do is enable the private sector to meet their own needs. So I would agree. I think it makes a lot of sense to partner with our industries to help them do this, but not try to one-time it and then hope they can hold on to them.
And should it be around retention or attraction?
I would say both. I would say both are equally as important.
I was going to say, I think that I agree with Chairman Tarwater's comment. Although I will say that I think about this in terms of worker retention, not as a financial incentive to keep existing workers, but more in that program description, in the language around like upskilling opportunities, around strategic opportunities for high demand jobs. So if I think about our talent pool across the state in multiple sectors, we have a lot of existing workers who we want to make sure that the total talent pipeline in our state is improving, increasing, right, adapting to the times, positioning for jobs of the future. And so I think about this talent pipeline as the training or the retraining, the upskilling side for existing workers, but then thinking about growing the overall pipeline requires that we have more people coming into the state. And that's maybe, I don't know right now that I would put one over the other, but you have to have both.
Yeah.
But under the goals and target outcomes, I'm not sure that I think about, I certainly don't think about existing employees like creating necessarily financial incentives for them to stay. It's more about the upskill side for existing. That's the way I think of it.
Yeah. That's got it. Tien?
Yeah, I just wanted, one fact or one statistic that resonates to me is like and Representative Tarwater said this before, like 62% of our college grads go. And so for sure the answer on this for me would be, we need to focus on recruitment and retention incentive programs of some sort. You can't bring them in and let them go out the back door. So how do we go about that? And one industry that's we all can probably relate to is what happened with the wireless industry. When you were with an existing carrier, they provided more incentives for the new recruitment from another carrier to come over than they did with the existing customer base already, from discounts on phones or whatever it is. They realized that was a complete mess, because they were literally just trading one person the other, and I don't want us to get in that carousel. And so now they actually provide the same benefits of that sort. So I wanted to state two things. Number one, it needs to be for both. And second, how do we focus on what incentives can we give our college grads to stay here, right? On top of recruiting new college grads to come, but but we need to keep who we have too. So
yeah. I almost, what I kind of heard was almost kind of like three things, which was, how do we keep our college grads here? How do we attract new talent into the state? And then how do we make sure that our existing talent is getting upskilled over time, right? And working with private industry around thinking through the solutions around those things. I kind of saw those three things in here. Anyone want to violently agree or disagree with me on that?
I'll agree with Sam's comment on that. I think the upscale, everyone has said has been important. I think Sam's comment about upskilling is really important. So if that could be kind of feathered in here a little bit more.
Yeah.
I'm not in love with that first sentence under goals and targets. I know it was meant to be illustrative, but and just listening to Ian kind of share, I kind of get more of his point. But I just the way that kind of comes out, and it's maybe just the first thing kind of jumps off the page a little bit.
Yeah, and it almost seems to me like if there were, like, I thought there were almost kind of like three elements of it, and having one number applied broadly doesn't make sense to me, because you would approach each one of those three things in somewhat of a different way. So, yeah. All right, well, if people don't have any more comments on this slide, we can kind of recraft. Let's go to the next one and take a look at the left-hand side and the right-hand side for a couple minutes. Then we'll discuss. Like I said, we were talking about a grouping of different things in that previous slide, so I'll be interested to see how people think about this slide. All right, I'll just, let's go to the left. Anyone have any thoughts on what's down there on the left-hand side?
Hey, John, I'll just throw this out. There was some comments I even had, or thoughts I had on the previous slide as well. Under the scope, on the providing incentives and tying benefits to living in Kansas, maybe Representative Tarwater or Senator Clays have more thought on this, but this goes back to, just personal for me. I'm a boomeranger. I left Kansas, and then came back later in life. And then also some Leadership Kansas conversation I know that took place during the border war discussion, and just incentivizing from Missouri to Kansas and ping-ponging back and forth. I guess I would throw out there the question, should we be using one-time catalytic investment dollars via Spark for that? Or is that a bigger conversation for state legislators to kind of figure out the right tax balance and other programs? I just don't know if the scope sentence reads right in my vision.
Yep. Representative Tarwater, any thoughts on that?
Well, I would agree with that. I know that it is an issue that we're focusing on in the legislature, but I don't see any problems with adding recruitment of past Kansans back to Kansas to this slide. I mean, it's easily done. If you can, and the Department of Commerce is currently kind of trying to figure out a database on how to figure out who they are and where they are. And it's more of an advertising program than anything, but we are looking at future tax programs that would benefit them for a few years to move back.
All right, thanks. Any thoughts on the left-hand side of the slide? Sam?
Yeah, John, I have a question around maybe why the reference specifically to regardless of race, socioeconomic status, et cetera, is in there. I asked the question not because I disagree with it, because I think that's important. I'm just wondering why that's specifically called out here, because that would be probably true for any of our projects.
Yeah.
We're not going to discriminate based on those things. So I guess by calling it out, it raises questions maybe on the other slides.
Yeah.
And then the other,
you probably could just go with the creates opportunities for diverse communities across the state, right?
right.
Yeah.
The other thing, and this is maybe minor, but we say young Kansans in there. Agree, but I think, you could say the same thing for older Kansans as well. I mean, we do want to attract less experienced in terms of the career workers who are in maybe strategic fields. But I don't know, we just might think about some of the words and phrases that are within that equity paragraph.
Yeah, I'm thinking we may want to just take out everything but creates opportunities for diverse communities across the state. Because it does get very specific there. Any other thoughts on the left-hand side before we go to the right? Oh, by the way, one thing I would ask is, are people on this call able to extend over maybe to like 2:15 or so?
I won't be able to today, John. Just
right.
Have a meeting right after this.
Well, here's what I'll do. I'm going to jump to. Got it. After this, I'm going to jump to kind of like how the homework's going to, how this would move to the next phase. And then we're just going to need to find a way to get input on the other ones. Great discussion. It's just we have a lot of areas to cover, and we had a few other discussions early on that threw us off the timeline a little bit. But on the parameters here, any thoughts against these parameters? In particular, maybe the way that third one is worded. Or the fourth one for that matter. So. Anyone?
Yeah, John, on that fourth one, I'm not sure. I mean, maybe existing agencies and programs can be leveraged, but it seems like maybe the scope is, beyond that.
Yeah.
When I read that, I, for whatever reason, I think about, just kind of throwing more money at an existing program or agency, and I don't think that's the intent.
Yep. It would be leveraging existing efforts where feasible, right? Or where it's the most appropriate. But yeah. Got it. Any other thoughts?
I would also say, go ahead.
John, my comment comes in actually on the first one, and this is probably more from an agricultural perspective, but serve high growth industries and high skilled workers. We still have a need for low skilled workers of all kinds. And then I just don't know if we want to specifically frame the high growth industries on that first bullet either.
Mm-hmm. What are other folks' thoughts?
Yeah, no, well, Ryan, I understand the point. I think there is needs across all of our industries. I think to be catalytic, that the high growth, I didn't read it that same way, but I get your point. I would skip to the next one, the second bullet point in what was shared. I think Sam shared, just to be consistent across the slides. We haven't really prioritized rural versus urban elsewhere and other programmatic elements. I don't know. Obviously, we all want to, help focus talent in rural Kansas, but across the state. So that jumps off to me is that we're prioritizing one over the other.
Mhm.
I would agree. And I think it's important to recognize that right now we have huge shortages in education, in healthcare, in the essential services, if you will. If we don't meet those needs and we don't focus on recruiting the folks to our state to fill those, none of the rest of it's going to matter. We have to have the basic services available for people. This state needs to be marketed far better than it's ever been marketed to the outside area. And if we're not meeting, again, basic human needs, what's the point? I think we have to be very cautious in what types of individuals we're talking about recruiting. This state needs everybody who's willing to work to be at the table to come into this state and get the job done.
Mhm. Any other thoughts on that one? How do people think about having a focus around this or just not having a focus around it in terms of the type of workers you're focusing on? Because that makes a huge difference, right? So,
John, the way that I think about that is that, each region of our state has its own needs. And so what may be a strategic area of need for talent in one sector of the economy in one geographic area may not be a strategic area for another part of the state. And so that's why there will be diversity in how these types of projects are funded in order to drive catalytic impact in each region, as each region has a specific need for certain talent.
mm-hmm. Got it. Okay. Any other thoughts on this before? What I'm going to suggest is, because since several people are going to need to drop off at the hour, I wanted to kind of go forward. We'll have to find a way to get your input on all the other ones as we go through, but I want to get a chance to talk about kind of the next steps, particularly around the homework.
John,
so
just real quick, if I could just jump in, though, I wanted to be clear about, I think Lana brought up, or somebody brought up, the specificity about we're prioritizing for rural area needs.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure, do we decide to expand that and not necessarily be specific to rural area needs, because we have workforce needs, obviously, everywhere. We have in urban sectors as well. And so I just want to make sure I heard that right, that we're going to kind of clean that language up to be broader, more comprehensive for the needs of Kansas.
Yeah, that's how I heard that.
Okay.
And then with what Sam said, those needs might be different from part of Kansas to part of Kansas. So in the interest of kind of like showing how this links to the next steps, could you go to slide, which slide are you on? Could you go to, which slide is this?
This is 39.
All right, could you go to 41?
Yep.
So in terms of the homework, and like I said, we're going to need to, we're not going to be able to do this immediately just because we didn't make it to the other pieces. So there were two things that we envisioned as a bridge from this meeting once everything's completed to the next one. So once we have a feel that those program area definitions and the parameters are well defined, offline, being able to get input from each of you on minimum and target funding scenarios by program area, kind of generally, and provide feedback on the program shape and rank the programs. So continue to get that. And then rate the idea submissions within the scope of those defined parameters for fit with the program parameters. So go to the next slide. where we can say kind of what that entailed. So in particular, on the right-hand side, on the idea submissions, and we've created, an Excel against it. And once again, we're going to have to relook at the timelines and everything now. So we'll have to get back to you on that. Was reviewing and rating each idea submission with either an H, an M, or an L, right? In terms of how does that fit within the programmatic area and the principles within each one of those programmatic areas that the panel had decided upon, right? And so that's a really important exercise. And that would be against the 315 idea submission. So depending upon, I'm just doing the math of it, depending upon how much understanding you have of the idea submissions and what approach you take, that could be as easy as putting HMs and Ls versus 315 idea submissions, or if you took like 3 minutes per idea submission, that's a lot of hours. And so we were trying to tee things up to say, okay, the panel's created some principles. Can we now then look at the idea submissions in the context of those? And then we would be able to take them on the other side and be able to say, what's the range of the ratings? What's the average ratings? And then be able to look at, okay, which idea submissions are floating to the top in terms of the best fit in the minds of the panel overall. So that's what we were looking at doing. Just so you have a feel for that. Go to the next slide. I don't know if this has like just even more. Next slide. We'd be getting you an Excel so that you'd be able to do that exercise, right? Just putting the H, the L, the H, the M's, and the L's in against them. And then you would have the program parameters, whatever ones we decided on or the panel decided on the side. So it'd be like very handy to either like dive in deeper on the idea submission if you wanted to, or if you felt you already knew it fairly well from looking at it a bunch of times over the past weeks, being able to put in that rating. And so that was the way, because it just would be unworkable for us to try and do that live in one of these sessions, because it would just be so much of an exercise going through it. But that's generally what we were thinking of doing. Now we're going to need to kind of rethink and maybe kind of create a follow-up to this session to make sure we get through all the other programmatic areas, make sure that we have the definitions crisp and the program parameters crisp so that we can then do this. So anyway, that's what we were looking at doing. I know people need to leave in like 3 or 4 minutes. Any questions on that? But that was the intent, to show you how it bridged.
John, this is Tim. I assume you're any outliers you're eliminating, or you're kind of putting these into buckets that fit into those before we have to, or
yeah. Okay. Yeah. If the idea submission fell in an area that the programmatic area wasn't defined around, then it's off on its own unless someone wants to fit it into one of these programmatic areas. And we did ask the last time to say if there are any submission ideas submitted that didn't have a home in a programmatic area but people thought were important, let us know. And we could potentially create a programmatic area around it.
So John, there were several projects and ideas in there that were more of an economic development type people draw, like would bring business to the area, that we didn't address in any of these programmatic ideas. So how would we go about talking about those? Are we going to rule those out just because we didn't really talk about them much?
I think the options would be to, one, either rule them out, because when the group looked at the places of greatest opportunity or need and like the levers that could drive the most catalytic long-term impact, hadn't come up with those areas. If there are some submission ideas that didn't fall in as a result of that exercise, once again, I'd say look at those specifically, and what we would need to do would be just kind of create another programmatic area around it to evaluate.
Yeah, because if we're doing nothing but churn the current Kansas economy, we're not really getting anywhere. But if we can bring people from other states into Kansas to experience different things and they spend their money here, that's more of an industry.
Oh, you're talking more like tourism.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I guess go back and look at if there's some that were like tourism specific, and we should create a programmatic area around that. We'll need to just get back to us on that so we can think that through.
And lastly, I think the least important thing that we're asking everyone to do is to assign a dollar figure as far as an average to spend on each deal, because you certainly don't want to rule some of these things out because the committee said we need to spend no less than 50,000 and an average of 20 or an average of $100,000 on each project, when some might require a few more dollars.
Yeah, we'll have to see which idea submissions fit in there, right? And then we'll just continue to shape. Yeah. Right.
So you're not going to rule things out that you're going to send up to us based on. You're not going to rule things out that you send to us based on the numbers that you have in these slides, right?
I'm not going to rule anything out personally. I think
Okay.
that we're going to reshape what's in the slides. Yeah, I'm just facilitating. So we're going to have to get back to the group in terms of kind of next steps around all this. We're going to need to, and I suspect it's going to require a follow-up session in order to kind of complete this before we can truly get the homework done. So, or we may think of some other options around that, but that's generally where we're heading.
So, hey, John, would you please send this out to the committee and allow a few days for feedback on the last two items? They might be pretty important to some of the people in this committee, and I don't want them to be overlooked. So if you could send this out, let people chime in if they would like, and then get us what they were saying.
Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Great. All right. With that, sorry we didn't get through everything. It was kind of a long putt to begin with, but appreciate your time and appreciate the engagement, which was awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone.